Welcome to our program. The topic is on the interplay between technology, ethics, and policy. My name is Hoda Mahmoudi. I'm the holder of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland. We are located in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, and today's lecture is co-sponsored by the Anti-Black Racism Initiative in the college and the Department of Sociology's Critical Race Initiative. So at the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Kate Seaman, who, as usual, is responsible for organizing all of our events. I really appreciate all the work that she does in the background. Also, my thanks to our faculty fellow, Mr. Malik Wilson, for his assistance with today's program. Now, it's of course a sheer pleasure to extend a warm welcome to the three speakers today, and I will introduce them to you in a very short time. But first, let me just remind the audience that we are recording this program today, and we will be posting it on our YouTube channel. So the program and the topic of this program is a continuation of the Bahá'í Chair's exploration of the big challenges which we face in our present world. And usually we focus on 5 themes to include the equality and empowerment of women, systemic racism and the root causes of prejudice, the failures of global governance, the problem of the degradation of the environment and climate change, and finally, our understanding of human nature. I think today's program will probably touch upon some aspect of all of those themes. Maybe not directly as in our discussion, but certainly it's a part of all those themes. When we conceived this event about a year ago, we really could not have imagined that there would be such an increase in the relevance of this crucial topic, both in our nation and in the world. In other words, this whole area of technology, of AI, and the ramifications of what it has for both our nation and the world is really quite amazing. If the good, the bad, and the in-between of considerations of technology were vitally important 1 year ago, I think they are even more so now. The work of these 3 scholars gathered with us today helps us to address the complex questions of technological advancement. Professor Reich, Sohami, Weinstein have dedicated their careers to asking important questions about the role that technology should have in shaping society and the role that society should have in shaping technology. Their scholarship points the way towards what all great academic works do: ponder the big questions while exploring the territories between the probable and the possible, the helpful and the harmful, and most importantly, offering solutions to such questions. Their work helps us to discern between beneficial disruptions and harmful ones, and gives us the practical tools, the data sets needed to make such assessments. These critical distinctions, the pros and cons of technological advancements, are absolutely necessary if we are to advance and increase the possibilities of peace in our world. So the format of today's program, I want to describe briefly. I will introduce our distinguished speakers in a minute, and each of them then will offer a short introduction on their perspectives on the topic today. We will then move right into the questions from the moderators. Dr. Kate Seaman and I will be moderating the questions. And as we go through the questions, we ask our audience to please post their questions using the Q&A function so that we can intersperse the audience questions with our own. So now it's really my pleasure to introduce our 3 scholars. Professor Rob Reich is professor of political science Director of the Center for Ethics in Society, co-director of the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, and Associate Director of the Institute for Human-Centered AI. Of course, all three of them are at Stanford University. He is also the author of System Error, Where Big Tech Went Wrong and How We Can Reboot It. He is a co-author with Professor Sahami and Weinstein. He is also author of Just Giving, While Philanthropy is Failing Democracy and How It Can Do Better, and also co-author Digital Technology and Democratic Theory, edited with Lucy Bernholtz and Aline Landmore. His teaching and writing these days focuses on ethics, policy, and technology. Professor Mehran Sahami, who I have to add is my cousin, and I'm very happy that he is with us today, is also at Stanford University. He was recruited to Google in its startup days by Sergey Brin, and is one of the inventors of email spam filtering technology. With a background in machine learning and artificial intelligence, he returned to Stanford as a computer science professor in 2007. Currently, he is the Tencent chair of the computer science department and also holds the James and Eleanor Chesebrough professorship in the School of Engineering. In his prior role as the assistant chair of education in computer science department, he helped redesign the program's undergraduate curriculum. He is one of the instructors of Stanford's massive introductory computer programming course taken by nearly 1,500 students per year. Mehran is also a limited partner in several venture capital funds and serves as an advisor to high-tech startups. He is also co-author with the other two speakers today on, as I said, the book on system error. Finally, but not least, Professor Jeremy Weinstein. He is a political scientist who went to Washington, D.C. with President Obama in 2009. As a key staffer in the White House, he foresaw how new technologies might remake the relationship between governments and citizens, and launched Obama's Open Government Partnership. When Samantha Power was appointed to the US ambassador at the United Nations, she brought Jeremy to New York, first as her chief of staff and then as her deputy. He returned to Stanford in 2015 as a professor of political science, where he now leads Stanford Impact Labs, a majority university initiative that partners research teams with leaders in the public, private, and social sectors to tackle important social problems. He is a prize-winning author and a decorated teacher whose expertise spans domestic politics and US foreign policy. And as I said, he is also an author with the other two on the book that I had mentioned. So now I would like to begin by asking Professor Reich to start us off, please. And welcome to all three of you.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be with you virtually, get a chance to talk about some of the ideas that the three of us have been working on now for something about 5 or 6 years span of time. And we really look forward to the dialogue with you all. So I'm the philosopher of the lot. Jeremy is the policy expert and social scientist, and Mehran, of course, is the technologist. And in certain respects, the very premise of our conversation today, the interplay between ethics, policy, and technology, is designed to be a conversation amongst these three disciplinary perspectives, or these three different frameworks. I'm going to give a really short overview about how the three of us came to start working together, came to write a book together, continue to do work together still today. Mehran will say something then about the book, and Jeremy as well about some of the recommendations that we make in the book in terms of thinking about the frontier agenda of ethics, policy, and technology. So I'm going to start just with a personal story. I have worked at campus for more than 20 years. And of course, I'm well aware of the centrality of the computer science department to the campus's identity, to Stanford's identity, to the close relationship that the university has with Silicon Valley. But I'd never really been a part of anything having to do with the School of Engineering or computer science department. I became powerfully aware of just how important this entire orientation was to Stanford University by undergraduate teaching. I would come to know students early on in their days at Stanford who would come to my office hours and talk to me about how excited they were to be at Stanford because they had an opportunity to hop on the computer science bandwagon, to be exposed to such exciting professors such as Mehran, and indeed the companies and venture capitalists that happen to populate campus as well. One particular conversation stands out to me. I was teaching a freshman year class. An 18-year-old came to my office hours in fall quarter. The person's only been on campus for something about 5 or 6 weeks, and I'm making some happy small talk with him in my office hours, welcome him to campus, and I asked what he was going to possibly study or what might he be majoring in. He said, I'm 100% sure going to be a computer science major. I can't wait to take the classes on venture capital and entrepreneurship and AI. And in fact, he told me he already had some startup ideas. And so I, the philosophy professor, said, oh, that's interesting. What are your startup ideas? And he looked at me straight in the eye and with utter sincerity and said, well, professor, I'd be happy to share them with you. But first, I would have to ask you to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And I inwardly rolled my eyes at him, thinking how charming it was that he thought his secrets wouldn't be safe with me, the philosophy professor, or even that I was relevant at all. But that gave me a hint at just how pre-professionalized even the 18-year-olds were in arriving on campus and thinking that their pathway, before they'd even taken a full quarter of classes, was to think about their startup ideas and to onboard themselves into Silicon Valley. Mehran is the legendary instructor on campus of the Introduction to Computer Science class, CS 106A in Stanford parlance. And he's taught more than half of the past decade of Stanford undergraduates in that or other courses. And Jeremy, with all the experience he had in the Obama administration and including his work as a social scientist, we came together to talk about initially the aspiration to make what we described as a cultural intervention on campus in order to try to expand the mindset of the computer science students who were gaining extraordinary and powerful skills as computer scientists in the majoring in computer science now in record numbers, but who hadn't gotten a complementary set of skills in policy and in questions about ethics. And so we started teaching a class that we spent more than a year in developing, integrating philosophy, public policy, and technical or technological questions into a single course. Ours is the only course that we're aware of on campus in which the hundreds of students who take it have to do in the same class technical assignments, policy memos, and philosophy papers. And we want to try to champion this kind of integrated orientation as the most important skill set of the 21st century. When the pandemic struck 1 year into teaching our class, we decided with a little more time on our hands, maybe we could take some of the material that we developed and then piloted in front of students and try to produce a book out of it. And that's what led us to begin writing System Error. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Mehran, who can give a little overview about the book itself.
Thanks, Rob. And thanks also for the opportunity to be here. It's really nice to be able to take part in this event. As Rob mentioned, when we came together to write the book, one of the things that was on our mind is thinking about what are the drivers that cause some of the issues that we see happen in technology, what we would refer to in the language of economists as externalities. Basically, technology companies develop new technologies, and in some sense, society has to absorb the costs that are associated with them, even though the companies themselves absorb many of the benefits. And one of the things we noticed in doing this work is, you see oftentimes individuals that are spotlighted, right? So Congress will have a hearing because there's some issue in technology, and they'll call Mark Zuckerberg and Sundar Pichai from Google and various other executives. And there's kind of a hearing in which there's a lot of buzz and flash, but not a lot comes out of it. And in our mind, this is not a story about individuals running the companies. It's actually a story of systematic drivers that have caused some of the impacts that we see and will continue to see some of the impacts we see. And that's what we wanted to unpack both in our class and in the book. So in terms of what some of those drivers are briefly, the first one is what we like to refer to as the optimization mindset. It's the notion that technologists are trained basically to optimize things, whether that be, in the classic sense of operations research, that you have an objective function and you're trying to optimize some value, or just a general orientation toward life where you're trying to make things run more efficiently or faster. When you take that mindset and you put it into a company, what it means is that there's particular metrics the company wants to measure to think about what it's optimizing. And to give you an example of that, Facebook, for example, or Meta now as it's called, its stated mission is to connect the world. Well, what does it mean to connect the world, and how do you measure that, and how do you optimize it? You need to come up with particular measurements of things you can actually measure, like how much time people spend on the platform, how many pieces of content they interact with, how much they click. And it turns out that those measurements are actually a poor proxy for really connecting the world, because people tend to click on content that is potentially inflammatory or potentially titillating. And so in some sense, it doesn't mean they're being more connected to other people. They're just interacting with the platform in a way that's being measured and optimized. And you combine that with the notion of trying to scale these kinds of systems, right? Companies are obsessed with trying to get bigger and having scale. Scale is an important factor in computer science in general. So what you get is a push from the people in the company and the funders of those companies to try to push these technologies as quickly as far as possible to optimize these metrics. And you can see that happening right now in this arms race around artificial intelligence, as the companies are sort of piling on to see how quickly they can push out the next technology. And we see an increasing pace actually of release of these products without a lot of thought as to what their full societal impacts will be. And then this happens in a regulatory environment in which there's a regulatory oasis around technology, because we live in a regulatory landscape that's now 30 years old, with the internet actually getting many of the restrictions around commercial traffic repealed. We did get a flowering of the internet in the mid-1990s. If you remember, Al Gore invented the internet. That's where that phrase came from. He didn't invent the technology, but he was responsible for many of the policies to actually help commercialize it. And so these factors have come together to push us into a world where technology is moving faster, things are being optimized, and there isn't necessarily much regard for what the societal externalities of that technology might be. To briefly touch on some of the technologies we talk about in the book, we hit on four major themes. One of those themes directly related to AI is the notion of algorithmic bias and fairness, that algorithms are more and more making important decisions about our lives, like who gets access to credit or finance, who gets what kind of medical treatments, whether or not bail is granted in the criminal justice system, a long list of things where algorithms now make choices for us. And it's not necessarily clear to us that, in fact, algorithms are being used in all those cases, or how fair these algorithms actually are. And there's lots of examples of, for example, discrimination based on gender or based on race from these algorithms. From there, we move into the theme of thinking about privacy, the fact that lots of your information is being collected on online systems, in many cases to power machine learning, which is a subfield of AI, which is what we're seeing now in terms of, many of the products that are released. But this has actually been going on for more than 20 years, where your data is being collected so inferences can be made about you, essentially so you can be targeted with advertising or other kinds of information. And that brings up questions as to what privacy rights you actually should have, and how those are being guaranteed or not by current regulation. We then begin to talk about artificial intelligence more broadly, the fact that, as we've seen play out in the last few years, these technologies will rapidly progress. They will potentially have impact on the labor market, that people will be displaced from jobs. And how do we try to think about that moving forward as these technologies get more and more powerful and have more of an impact in terms of what job markets actually look like? And finally, we talk about the notion of free speech and democracy and the power that these large companies or platforms have. this is something that's also related to AI because it has to do with the notion of, as AI becomes more powerful and can generate content, now we're seeing more and more real photorealistic images being generated by this technology, text being generated by this technology that looks as though it were written by humans. The opportunity to misinform and disinform people and have that information pushed out at scale becomes a much greater threat to our democracy and to our notions of human dignity. And so those are some of the themes in the book. I'll turn it over to Jeremy to talk about what are some of the things we can potentially do.
Great, thanks so much. And it's a pleasure to be here. So we're now in a ChatGPT moment, and that's actually where our book ends. Although the book came out 2 years ago, anticipating finding ourselves in a situation where yet another revolutionary technology was being rolled out with all sorts of potential commercial benefits to be realized, improvements in the productivity for companies and individual workers, but all sorts of social costs that were not being internalized. And so in that sense, it's Groundhog Day all over again. And where the book goes from, for the central arguments that Meron described and the particular technological frontiers that he mentioned, is to say, as a society, we've generally approached the impacts of technology as if they're somehow fixed or predetermined. That as beneficiaries of what technology enables, we kind of have to live with and accept the consequences. We use the metaphor of a wave that washes over us when we're standing on the beach. We can't shift the wave in any consequential way. We get to be in the ocean, but that wave washes over us. And we think that mindset is just wrong. That in fact, the impacts of technology are something that we are well positioned to shape. And we can shape it as consumers. We can shape it as people who build technology or finance technology companies. We can also shape it as voters who influence a political system that creates the enabling environment or ecosystem in which technology companies do their work. But up until the present, that power has been largely unutilized. Our approach has been to vest in the leadership of technology companies the authority and influence to referee the critical value trade-offs that new technologies bring to the fore, and to assume or accept that those decisions are going to be ones that benefit society writ large. But as you might have seen with Jeff Hinton's resignation from Google, yet again, we find ourselves at a moment where significant concerns are being raised about whether the technological frontier generates a set of social risks that are not best managed inside companies themselves, but that really have fundamentally political and social implications and need to be refereed elsewhere. So while the book goes through a set of what you might call point solutions, what should we do about privacy? How should we think about algorithmic bias? What are the right investments to deal with the automation consequences for the workforce? The bigger message of the book is that the ChatGPT moment that we're in now is no different than the moments that we've experienced in the last 5 and 10 years, and no different than the moments that we're going to experience in the next 5 or 10 years. And that to address a dynamic in which the private sector continues to generate technologies that produce significant economic benefits, but also significant social harms, we're going to need to move towards more systemic solutions, not just point solutions to solve the particular problems in front of us. And what are those systemic solutions that we focus on? Well, 3 in particular. The first is that the pace of technology is always going to be faster than the pace at which democracy can respond. And for that reason, we really need to build and cultivate and incentivize patterns of self-regulation and industry regulation within technology. We use the model of the professionalization of the life sciences as a framework for thinking about how, dating back 150 years, the life sciences really saw an evolution that recognized the social responsibility to develop innovations that provide benefits, but also to mitigate the potential harms that come with the power of being a doctor or a life scientist. And we saw that framework really exercise its influence as CRISPR technologies were designed, and people were attentive to the dual use concerns in that context. The second issue that is systemic is to recognize the concentration of power in a small number of technology companies, the deeply undemocratic ways in which value trade-offs are being refereed in corporate boardrooms or in C-suites, and that ultimately that concentration of power is not allowing not only for challenges in the private sector to the dominance of these particular players, but also diminishing for consumers the variety of choices that they might need if they want a different content moderation strategy, if they want a different balance between privacy and personalization. And then the last piece of the puzzle is, how do we build a democracy that is capable of governing technology? And our central message here is that we have the democratic institutions that we deserve, in the sense that we've created the conditions in which our democratic institutions lack technological expertise and know-how. That's a deliberate choice to dismantle scientific expertise in government that has unfolded as part of the deregulatory zeal since the 1970s and 1980s. If we want a democracy that's capable of navigating not just the ChatGPT moment, but all of the ChatGPT moments that we can expect in the next decade or two, we have to make a deliberate investment in bringing into our political institutions the kind of technical expertise, and then incentivizing the companies to show up as collaborators and not just efforts focused on avoiding regulation, recognizing, as Mark Zuckerberg has and others, that they actually don't want to foot the bill. They don't want to hold primary responsibility for figuring out what speech is allowed online or how to referee these value trade-offs. But we're going to need to build up democratic institutions that can get into the game. And so those are the kind of systemic areas in which we're going to need significant reforms that go beyond any particular piece of legislation that may address the problem that we see today. So with that, I hope that provides a helpful introduction, and we'll go back to our hosts to open up the Q&A.
Thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about, and I'm sure that the audience will begin to post their questions. Let me just start us off by asking, in your opinion, and anyone of you can answer these questions, what are some of the key ethical questions you think that big tech companies should be grappling with?
I'll give a beginning start on that. So as Mehran described, one kind of ordinary way to understand the moment we're in with respect to the past 20 or 30 years of the growth of big tech companies is that what starts off as bringing the fruits of basic research in artificial intelligence or various other forms of technical development to the marketplace through private capital and then small companies that begin then, once they grow to great scale, to begin to consolidate, is that an enormous number of benefits are produced. And certainly we can all point to the fantastic array of benefits that the internet and social media and a whole variety of other things has given us, but also a variety of negative externalities or unintended social consequences happen. And then the question arises, how is it that the incentive structure of the companies produces reasons for them to ignore or incentives for them to ignore these negative externalities? So a simple ethical question is then to pose ourselves the challenge of how do we get companies to internalize the negative externalities? All right, let's be more direct about this rather than abstract. Algorithmic decision-making is a ubiquitous feature of our worlds today, whether it's hiring algorithms or credit scoring algorithms or criminal justice algorithms, et cetera, et cetera. We all know that there's the potential for various forms of algorithmic bias or unfairness. How can we ensure that as we further deploy algorithms in the world for decision-making, we try to minimize or eliminate the various forms of bias that they can propagate? In social media, we're aware of the fact that there are unprecedented opportunities for human beings to communicate with one another. The internet and social media has made all of us producers of content in certain ways, and we can access an unbelievable ocean of material online. That's been a huge upside for people in their communicative capacities. At the same time, the algorithms that have to sort through the ocean of content also can amplify misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. And because the companies have an incentive to engage people on their platforms in order to serve them ads, as they amplify misinformation and disinformation that tends to excite people and keep them on the platform, they don't have, as it were, a clear incentive to diminish that material in the way that they might otherwise. keep going with these kinds of questions, but that's the first pass at a set of ethical challenges. Now, let me add, because Jeremy, I think, appropriately accelerated the content of the book to our present moment, thinking about we live in the moment of generative AI and ChatGPT. And so there, it's important at least to put on the table the question that the accelerating pace of development in AI and generative AI has reached a point where we really do have to confront the possibility of machine intelligence that's on a par with or perhaps superior to human intelligence. And how does the prospect of generative AI or general AI threaten not merely the livelihoods of human beings who are in paid employment that could be replaced so easily by machines, but also threaten the very understanding of what it is to be human? You introduced me, Professor Mahmoud, with the description that I'm part of the Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. Now, of course, we chose that description here, human-centered AI, quite deliberately. But I'll share with you that when we first had our launch conference, someone came up to me and said, "Why did you call it human-centered AI? Because if the machines are more intelligent than humans, shouldn't we live in an age of machine-centered artificial intelligence? Shouldn't humans willingly make ourselves subservient to super intelligent machines?" That's what I have in mind by a powerful ethical question about what it means to be human in the age of super intelligent machines.
Thank you. Kate?
Thank you, Hoda. So taking a slightly different approach, what, if any, are the positive impacts that you see coming from big tech? So we heard a little bit about some of the negatives, the risks, but what are some of the positive impacts that you see?
Well, maybe I'll take a first attempt at that, which is there actually are tangible positive impacts. So when we look at some of the impacts of AI, for example, in healthcare, one of the things that has been found over the past few years is that for certain kinds of diagnosis tasks, especially for areas like cancer detection, the algorithms can actually do as well, if not better in many cases, than human beings. So if we were to actually deploy some of these algorithms in the right context where we have safeguards around things like patient privacy and use them as an augmentation to doctors, there's actually a potential to be able to improve health outcomes for people because the machines can actually do diagnosis better. They can assimilate a greater quantity of information and a greater level of detail than human beings have shown a propensity to do. There's also the potential for things like overcoming human bias. I mean, one of the things when we talk about algorithmic bias is it has its pros and cons. The con is clearly that it automates bias in a way that can scale it to an even greater extent. But the pro is when a human being is making biased decisions, you can't see inside their brain to understand what is actually causing that bias. With an algorithm, you can actually try at least to make some attempt to understand why it's making biased decisions, how the data is entering into that biased decision-making process, and then think about steps to try to mitigate it so you actually get less biased decisions than a human being. So these are the prospects that the machine age brings to us, or artificial intelligence brings to us. It allows us to have a level of examination that we don't have with human beings. And ultimately, what I think AI gives us, it gives us a mirror to our society. When these kinds of problems come up, they're often based on the fact that many of these AIs are trained based on historical data of human decision-making. And so when we find things like biases in the criminal justice system or in credit scoring, it's oftentimes because the humans that historically made those decisions actually exhibited bias, but we never measured that in a systematic way or thought about ways that we could address it, because it's difficult to change people's behavior, and actually being able to measure and replicate the kinds of decisions they would make is difficult to do. But those are things that you can do with machines. So the promise there is really, could we create a more fair society by understanding some of these issues? Could we actually then take these reflections and think about how human beings are behaving, and also use the technology for our own benefits in lots of different areas, including things like healthcare and autonomous vehicles? So the potential impacts are real, but we just need to think about them relative to the costs that are involved as well.
Okay, I'm going to go to a question from our audience. Aaron Leah, Do you think that something like GDPR could work within America's current political landscape? And out of curiosity, what are your thoughts on the TikTok ban? GDPR.
Yeah, so I'll introduce this and provide some context in case it's not familiar to everyone. GDPR is the Generalized Data Protection Regulation. It is the model privacy law that was adopted by the European Union in the middle part of the last decade. And in some sense, it represented the first effort by a set of governments to reestablish the balance between privacy rights or privacy protections and the ways in which personal information was being organized, used, and monetized by private companies to deliver personalized content, but in particular, personalized advertising. And it gets to the core of the business model of all of these free products that we download and use. Why are they free? They're free because we are the product, and the information that is gathered from our behavior is extraordinarily valuable as a profit-making entity. These are, in effect, largely advertising platforms. And so Europe has a long history of concern with privacy rights that are much more enshrined and stronger than in the United States. And so it wasn't that surprising in some sense that Europe would be the context in which citizens and their elected officials would begin to mobilize and say, actually, I need transparency about how my data is going to be used. I need the ability to erase my data. If I want to remove myself from a platform, I have what's called the right to be forgotten. If my data is going to go into a process that produces some automated decision, I need to know that the decision was automated, and I need the ability to challenge that automated decision and to be heard in challenging that automated decision. There are a whole set of principles that are embedded in GDPR. And because the European Union is an extremely strong market, basically Europe's adoption of the GDPR was a shot across the bow of the tech companies, that if you need to redesign your platforms to be responsive to a set of regulatory moves from Europe, ought you not to redesign your platforms to hold yourself to that higher standard of privacy protections for the world over? And that's kind of the moment we've been in for the last 7 or 8 years. The first implementation of GDPR, concerns about maybe technical mistakes or some misguided elements of GDPR. You then got California moving forward with its own privacy regulations that were modeled on GDPR, the first privacy regulations in the United States. The establishment of privacy regulators in different countries around the world that begin to carry out the kinds of investigations to figure out whether privacy rights are being violated. Let's just contrast this framework for a second with the way privacy is generally handled in the United States, which is a framework called notice and consent. You have all experienced this. You basically download an application and it says, do you accept all of the conditions of this application? And you click through it as quickly as possible, 50 pages of language in a language that you cannot understand, and you hit accept, accept, accept because you want to share a photo or you want to access some particular social media platform. That is our form of privacy protection in the United States. Some basic obligation to inform, and then you accept. And if you accept, everything goes. Now, when we think about our health information or our education information, there are much greater constraints that exist on the end users of your data. You're not simply in this basic notice and consent. They're just limitations on how data can be used because we're concerned about potential misuse. GDPR is about resetting that balance. And I think we've said for a long time, the three of us in our teaching and more broadly, that we think national privacy legislation is the lowest hanging fruit on the tree. If there's anything that Democrats and Republicans in their zeal to counter big tech ought to be able to agree on, it's on some basic guardrails with respect to the collection and monetization of personal data that give much more power and autonomy to end users in this circumstance. And so every year we get a set of bipartisan bills introduced that are about privacy regulation. And I expect at some point one of those bills will pass, even though Congress is as polarized as it is. But that then brings me to the comment that I want to make about TikTok. which is, in addition to our anti-big tech zeal, there's also an anti-China zeal in the United States. And the anti-China zeal is what we see on display in the kind of concerns that are being raised about TikTok. But let's abstract away from China and say, what is really at stake in the conversation about TikTok? Two things. Number one, what privacy protections are people entitled to? Not just vis-a-vis TikTok, but vis-a-vis any company that has access to your personal data. And the second is, what kinds of concerns do we have about the way in which algorithmically generated content may be polluting our information ecosystem or even undermining the health and well-being of our kids? And the downside of the way in which the TikTok ban has been framed is that we're not having conversations about those issues. We're having conversations about banning a single platform, and banning a single platform will not solve either of those other issues. So China becomes the leading edge that enables us to solve concerns about China with respect to privacy or the harms to kids of the use of a platform, but not to actually solve those problems, which are the big overarching questions that the TikTok debate raises.
Thank you. Following on from that a little bit, the next question I want to ask is, how do you think big tech has changed the balance of political power? And so in the introduction, you mentioned that society is absorbing the costs of new technology while the companies are absorbing the benefits of these technologies. So in connection with that, what then is big tech companies? What are their responsibilities given the amount of power that they hold today?
All right. Well, if it seems like we're going in sequence here. I'll say one or two things about this. I want to, sort of gesture at my colleague Mehran and colleagues Jeremy and Mehran in particular to add here, since Mehran has experience from within a tech company, Google, and Jeremy has experience within the federal government during the Obama administration. But the basic spirit I want to begin with is that there's a familiar kind of, you could even call it a law, or at the very least a regular empirical phenomenon, which is that as any company or any particular sector becomes extremely powerful in the marketplace, gains extraordinary market value, as indeed the big tech companies have, becoming the largest companies in the world, they tend to convert market power into political power, whether that's through lobbying or various other ways of influencing government's orientation to it. And in this particular sector in big tech, there are two additional features to point out here. The first is, as Mehran already described, the history of the creation of Silicon Valley and big tech goes hand in hand with a deliberate decision in Washington, D.C. to place a regulatory oasis around Silicon Valley companies, to leave more or less entirely free from regulation internet companies to develop so that America could win the race to pave the information superhighway. Now, maybe that was a wise decision at the very start, but for the reasons we've gone through in the past half hour, we now see all of the potential downsides, and it's time for our regulatory agencies to step up to the plate and face the challenges that we have. The second feature I'd point to is the fact that there are all kinds of interesting studies that point to what often gets called a techno-libertarian mindset amongst the founders of Silicon Valley or technology companies, an expectation that even if the preponderance of people who work in tech companies tend to vote for Democrats, are sort of on the left of the American political spectrum, they nevertheless wish for a minimum of regulatory environment. And so there's a sense in which if you take an optimization mindset with a techno-libertarian orientation, what the tech companies are optimizing for is a bare minimum of government. And that's a peculiar or fragile, kind of place to be in a moment in which the consequences of these tech companies have great upside, but also great downside. Mehran or Jeremy, if you want to add anything, please go ahead.
Go ahead, Mehran.
Sure. So the two things I would add is, the situation you need to think about is what places guardrails around companies, right? Companies have a push toward making profits. It's demanded by their shareholders. It's what also makes the executives and many of the rank and file employees at those companies that offer stock options wealthy. And so there is a push internally at the company to do more and more, to gather more data, to make the kinds of inferences and to include more automation to allow them to gain greater market share, to be able to scale. So there's these constant pressures internally at the companies. Now, at the same time, some of them have instituted ethics boards or review boards internally, and with mixed results, because we've seen in some cases, especially in the most recent round of layoffs that happened in many big tech companies, their responsible AI teams or responsible innovation teams were among the teams laid off because they were seen as essentially slowing down the rate of product release because they were asking tough ethical questions. It also raises the bigger question as to where should these decisions actually get made? At this point, the decisions are getting made by a small group of individuals in these companies, whether they're the engineers that build the technologies or the product designers that create the design or the executives that decide on the release or how to structure resources in the company around what technologies are they're actually going to push. And part of our point is that when these kind of algorithms have significant societal impact, the decisions around what algorithms get used, how they get deployed, and how they impact people shouldn't just be left up to a small group of people who are not democratically elected in these companies. We need to have greater societal input in the regulation of these technologies because the impacts are being felt at a societal level. With that, I'll turn it over to Jeremy.
I mean, the last thing I'd just say on this question is, yes, we need this to move from corporate politics to democratic politics. We need to broaden the range of stakeholders that have a voice, because ultimately the effects of technology are something all of us experience, whether or not we are users of technology, right? Like we give the example of, you can delete Uber or you can delete Facebook, you can delete Twitter if ultimately that's your orientation. But the damage that any of those platforms may do to the information ecosystem or the impact of Uber and Lyft on the kind of welfare budget role for the state of California in which we live, those are things that I experience as a taxpayer or a democratic citizen, regardless of whether I'm a technology user. That's kind of the essence of externality. But there is all sorts of accountability relationships and power that exists even before we get to the state. And so I just want to give two examples on that front. So the first is, in the aftermath of the question of platforming and deplatforming Donald Trump and the challenges in that moment, those who were in charge of social media platforms recognized that this power that they were exercising to determine content guidelines or so-called community standards had them making all sorts of tough decisions that they preferred not to have the finger pointed at them entirely on their own. And so, for example, the creation of the Facebook Oversight Board might have strengths as a governance mechanism, it might have weaknesses as a governance mechanism, but its very existence was a signal that even corporations felt uncomfortable about how much power was concentrated in the C-suite to make fundamental decisions that, in Facebook's case, affected not only the 2 billion plus users, but also had consequences for people off the platform. And so they were in search of legitimacy for their decision-making, in search for some sort of independence. And that is a big opportunity for accountability that didn't exist 5 years ago. The other example I just give you in terms of where power rests is power rests in workers. One of the reasons that the three of us are so excited on an annual basis to teach most of Stanford's computer science graduates is that we see their talent and their brain power as perhaps the most valuable asset that companies in Silicon Valley are recruiting for and competing over. And when that sleeping giant awakens, not just thinking about what they're paid and whether they get high quality food in their cafeteria, but instead when they think about things like, on whose behalf do I want my technical superpowers deployed? How comfortable am I with those technical superpowers being deployed on behalf of, say, the counterterrorism operations of the US government, or the behavior of ICE with respect to identifying and deporting migrants in the United States? How do I feel about being a part of a company that puts sexual harassment out of sight via non-disclosure agreements? When this sleeping giant awakens, companies have to respond. And part of our goal is to ignite that sense of agency among young technologists who feel constrained by their technical know-how to fit into large machines and play preordained roles when in fact they're among the most powerful people in the world, yet they act as automatons. And so in the absence of them exercising that human agency, we may as well have ChatGPT playing that role, right? And instead, what we need is not a prediction of the next line of code, but like, should this code even be written? And who is it benefiting and who is it harming? Those are things that we know ChatGPT can't do intelligently. And that's the human element that we have to make at the center here. And that's power that is heretofore not being fully exploited.
Thank you. I think that feeds nicely into the next question from the audience, from Nandini Sharma, who says, "Dear panelists, thank you for providing an overview of your work. The way we are framing these issues of technology, ethics, and policy, including the vocabulary, seems to privilege, at least from a technological perspective, the decisive power of technology design. I'd appreciate it if you could talk about the place that programming languages have in nudging technology design in unanticipated and emergent ways."
Well, I might jump in on that, given that I teach programming languages. And what I'd say is there is an issue itself around the programming language themselves, but I would say that that's less of an issue than the actual design. And the design comes to the question of who are the people who are developing the technology and what are their priorities. And to give you a sense as to how large an impact design actually has, it brings up the question of who is technology being built for, what sort of skills do they need to have, and that means who's favored by the technology and who's not. So if you look at the development of computing technology and you go back, say, 40 years ago, we had command lines, right? If you want to use a computer, you didn't have icons and a desktop and all this other stuff. You had to type a set of things, and you needed to know what were the commands and how they would work. And the set of people in the world who understood that was exceedingly small. And we got a revolution in computing with the design of the graphical user interface, where now many more people could participate in the power of computing because they had a nice interface that allowed them to double click on things, to be able to bring up a word processor and to interact with their computer in a way that didn't require them to understand as much of the arcana as they did before. Then we got another revolution in the mid-1990s with the World Wide Web that said, what we're going to do is make it easy for you to not only access information on your own computer, but to access information around the world that other people can provide. And originally that system was built to be able to share data on physics experiments, but people in design got involved and said, what we're going to do is make a web browser that is actually easily usable by many people. And then there were commercial interests that got involved. This the same time that you're getting some of the repeal of regulation with respect to commercial activity on the internet, to say that if we can actually build things that a lot of people can use, that also creates the opportunity to, say, sell lots of things to people or to show them advertising or whatever the case may be. So it's the underlying, more than the programming language that's used to build these applications, I would say the sensibilities of the people doing design around these things make the big difference as to who actually gets access to the technology and how they can use it. And now we're in another moment, and that moment is around access and usage of AI. So there's questions as to how these systems are built and how usable are they. We've had AI technologies for many years now, but it's interesting that ChatGPT is actually now considered the fastest growing consumer application ever. It reached 100 million users in 2 months. No application's ever done that in history. And you could ask, why was that? And part of the reason why that was they had an interface that was easy to use. There weren't limitations around more or less on who could use it. Most people could get access if you just signed up for an account. And it seemed tremendously powerful. And so it got a lot of press attention, and that brings in more users. Now, it didn't have to be that way, right? It could have been, for better or for worse, it could have been designed to have limited access to a certain group of people to evaluate the technology before it was released more broadly. The aspects of the technology that were released could have actually been more limited than to say you have access to the full technology that's there. So these are design decisions that people make, right? There are the people in the companies that make them. They could potentially be regulatory decisions that get made, but they do have a significant impact on how we view that technology and the impact it has on us, because it answers the crucial question of who gets access to that technology and who is it really built for. right? And if you think about things like gig economy platforms like Uber or Lyft that Jeremy mentioned, you could say those platforms at one level, they are democratizing the notion of transportation, but they also include a power dynamic as to who's actually benefiting from that change in the employment dynamic and who may be getting harmed from it. For example, the drivers or taxi cab drivers in the past who relied on a particular economic dynamic. We're seeing many of those things unwind in different ways because this technology is being released and favors particular populations over others.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the next question from our audience, Ash Rahmani. How do we address the predominance of the historical development of digital tech in the global north to ensure against the dangers of possible digital colonialism?
I think Rob's going to point to me because I have experience in foreign policy. So when questions like this come up, he has to point at me to jump in. It's been interesting as we've been teaching students and writing our book and sort of being out talking about these issues. We're at a moment where I think there is, increasing recognition that we have a challenge not only about the concentration of decision-making power in the hands of a small set of companies, but also that when we talk about expanding the conversation about regulation, we have a challenge of the concentration of power in the hands of elected politicians or professional technocrats in the bureaucracy or voters in a small number of well-off advanced economies that maybe don't speak to the particular value trade-offs or concerns that might exist more broadly in the global South. And we already see countless examples over the last decade of technological innovation where decisions that are made inside corporate boardrooms or inside regulatory environments in the global north have consequences in environments where people don't have any ability to hold these companies accountable. So you think about hate campaigns online and the way that that has played out in Myanmar with respect to the Rohingya or with Muslims in India, the use of apps and their content moderation rules that often don't exist to stir up hate and to generate offline violence. People are using legal mechanisms to try and hold the companies accountable, but things are relatively limited in the ability of frameworks to ensure that accountability. Or we can think about end-to-end encryption, which presents challenges in a democratic system if you're trying to serve the interests of a collective and you want access to penetrate criminal networks, but has real advantages inside authoritarian regimes where the desire for surveillance may really stand in the way of things like freedom of expression and freedom of association. And so we exist in a global landscape that doesn't have an easy solution to what is the right regulatory environment in which to referee these trade-offs. So what do we do in that world? Well, the kind of extreme example is to say we need an international organization. If we just had an international organization where every country showed up, with kind of equal voice and power, we could get an internet, that really speaks to the needs of populations writ large. But as someone who served as the deputy to the US ambassador to the United Nations, that very motivation was what was behind creating the United Nations in the aftermath of World War II. And we need to understand two things about the United Nations. The first is that a significant amount of the action happens in the Security Council, and the Security Council is not some equitable distribution of power across every country in the world. It's controlled by the Permanent Five, and it reflects distributions of geopolitical power in 1945. And so when one builds international mechanisms, one can only generate agreement with mechanisms that serve the interests of those who have power and those who want to maintain that power. There's no version of a kind of global government that can avoid that problem. But there's a second, even deeper problem, which is that those who represent populations in governance settings often don't have any democratic accountability to those that they represent. And so even if you might have countries represented in these global fora, the extent to which citizens' own concerns are represented is very unclear. Myanmar, again, represents a good example. The violence was committed by the government and its associated ethnic militias against the Rohingya. So Myanmar's representation in a global governance setting doesn't solve the issue that the Rohingya population faces as victims of violence in that context. Okay, what I've basically done is admire the problem and tell you it's 100 times harder than it sounds to address this. And I guess I'd end by just saying, I think there are two important ingredients in making progress on this. The first is activating people to care, and activating people to care not just in the United States, but all around the world. That is, the more that people don't see technology as something that's inaccessible, but instead understand that whether or not you understand convolutional neural nets, you're entitled to have a view about the consequences of generative large language models for the future of your employment. You're entitled to have a view on social media platforms and their content moderation policies and how that affects your identity, right? And the risk of harassment and bullying. And we need people to develop those informed views so that they can begin to articulate them. And then the second responsibility is for those of us who live in regulatory environments where one can exercise control on companies, and that's largely right now Europe and the United States. We need to be thinking about constituencies that extend far beyond the constituencies that are our immediate neighbors, because ultimately the choices that we make in Washington or Brussels have these global consequences.
Thank you. The next question from Margaret Pearson asks, how do regular citizens know what information about technology risks and protections to trust? So TikTok is a good example, with appealing ads by lobbyists against a ban and political rhetoric in favor of a ban. But more broadly, it seems destined to be left to various experts. So this forum is a great start, but obviously has a smaller audience. Any thoughts on resources that people could access to help inform themselves better?
I'll begin quickly on that, which is that terrific question reveals not something specific about TikTok or technology, but as a standing feature of a citizen's experience or a consumer's experience with a whole variety of things. We just need to think about, COVID and all of the various questions that arose about people in various forms of expert service or, various regulatory bodies. We citizens always face the question of how do we generate trust in people who claim expertise. And in the case of technology, one thing at least is clear for these consumer-facing products like TikTok, which is you can observe, if you're a parent, how frequently your children are using various products. And even without understanding anything more than that, you can already begin to make some assessments about whether you think it's healthy or unhealthy. Social media poses a whole variety of challenges on that front. So I'd begin from that experiential standpoint. Beyond that, there are a whole host of independent civil society organizations that try to provide information in a general way outside of the government and outside of the companies themselves. So here in California, for instance, there's an organization called Common Sense Media. That's a nationwide organization that's doing a lot of work on trying to understand policy with respect to technology and children. I would begin there. They have information about TikTok in particular, but there's a whole variety of other organizations as well that wouldn't be too hard to discover just through some ordinary web searching.
Anyone else on that one? No? Okay. How do you think education for engineers should be adapted given the implications of the products they develop?
That's a great question, and it's something that we're grappling with right now as we're trying to train the next generation of engineers. There's a few different directions that we're thinking. I mean, obviously our class is one attempt in that direction to say that there needs to be more consideration of what are the ethical issues, what are the implications for society from the technologies that are being built, and to inculcate a sense of responsibility among technologists to say that you're not just building technology, you're impacting people's lives, and you need to be aware of that and take that responsibility seriously. You need to have frameworks to think about what that means and how you should evaluate your technologies or the ideas behind it before they're just put out in the larger landscape and generating these externalities. Besides the class that we have to do that, we have a project called Embedded Ethics going on. that the idea is to make ethics an inescapable part of an engineering education, at least in computer science right now, and then to expand it out further. And the idea is to have modules around topics in ethics embedded in technical classes throughout the major, so that students don't just think of ethics and their social responsibilities as kind of a thing that happens on the side or an extra class they have to take and check off in terms of their university requirements, but is actually part of the engineering process that they revisit over and over in classes, in different classes in various forms. And the idea behind this, sort of the long-term vision, is to think about how do we actually change the process by which the development of software is done. And if I give you a historical perspective on this, in the very early days of software development, like in the 70s, people just kind of hacked software. There was a small group of developers and a few technical companies or academics, and they hacked up a bunch of software. And as software began to become a much larger industry, there was really an understanding that there was a need for quality assurance to be able to test software in some systematic way before you released it. So now every serious software company has actually a pretty large quality assurance organization of software testers. In the mid-1980s, people began to take the notion of computer usability more seriously. And this is something that we sort of talked about, is who has access to technology. When we moved from the world of a command line where you had to type particular commands to a graphical user interface, people realized that understanding people's interaction with technology became a more critical part of software development, and that became embedded in the design and development of software. So now every serious software company has a group of people that do user interface and user experience design. And a few years back, when we got the taking off of the internet, when more things became available online, computer security became a serious issue. And we still see computer security breaches, but no serious software company doesn't have a group of people that are worried about security. We think it's time to take the next step in that evolutionary process of software development and say that companies need to, in the same way they think about quality assurance and about usability and about security, think about the societal impacts of their products. That needs to become part of the software development process, both in terms of at the outset, thinking about what products you build, throughout the life cycle of the product to understand who you're designing for and the potential impacts that can happen, and on the tail end to understand what are the potential impacts of your technology, thinking about things like red teaming or auditing algorithms for bias, things that are not particularly onerous, but we don't have any regulation around currently, to say those are the things we need to do. And it needs to be a combination both of the training we give to engineers to understand this is something they should be thinking about in their development process and demand from their employers, and also something that can benefit from regulation, saying there have to be particular kinds of testing, for example, that you do before you release a software product. So there's multiple facets to it, but a lot of it is, we want to believe can be embedded into the educational process for engineers. And that's going on at Stanford and many other institutions currently.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then leading on from that, I guess at the next stage, how can we work to better address the inequalities within technological development? So whose problems are solved versus ignored, who benefits versus loses, whose voice is heard or is unheard, and then connected to that, how do we ensure that the right people are at the table when we are defining these problems and then seeking the solutions to them?
I'll just say one quick thing, and then with apologies, I have to drop off, and I think Jeremy wants to add something too. So let's begin with something familiar, but no less important or significant, even though it's familiar. We have to significantly broaden and expand the pipeline of talent that works on these questions, both from within tech companies and within policymaking and civil society organizations. The question before about the global north and the global south is another version of this. You can't expect people within a company to understand the issues and anticipate the issues that might confront people in far-flung places unless there are voices within the company to bring those perspectives to the table. And you can go further by saying the very kinds of products or questions that tech companies and founders pose themselves would likely be different if, in fact, we had much broader representation from people around the world creating these companies. Mehran sometimes likes to say to our students in class, I think with an element of truth and a little element of snark or sarcasm, that it's a little bit depressing to see how many startup companies there are whose business model is to produce lunches to deliver to other startup companies. The basic idea being that the kind of thing that presents itself to a 23-year-old wannabe founder is to solve the problems of a 23-year-old tech bro. And that's not exactly a way to get working on the urgent problems of the world. So with that, I'll pass it over to Jeremy.
Rob gave that point about lunch delivery. I was going to give the example of the web internet app that we often describe, which is Swimply. You may not have used Swimply, but it's designed to help solve the problem of getting access to a swimming pool if you need one but don't have one. And so here you can rent hours at people's swimming pool. All of that unused time at the swimming pool is now monetized. And of course, it solves a real need for people in hot places to get in cool water. But who decided that that's a problem worth solving? And I guess I just add to Rob's point by saying the kinds of inequalities that you described, Kate, are reinforced at every stage of this process. It's not just who are the engineers, right? But it's then who has leadership roles in companies? Who are the venture capitalists that allocate capital to these companies, right? Who has a voice in the regulatory process? And all of these inequalities are just reinforced at every stage. And if we want something different out of tech, we're going to have to really rethink who's in tech. We're going to have to rethink who tech is accountable to. And that isn't just about the relationship with government. It's who sits on the board. It's what are the stakes of employees in the future decision-making of the company. It's how do we think about the returns that accrue to venture capitalists who can basically, gamble on companies without regard to their social consequences. And as long as one is massively successful, you do your exit and you never bear any of the downside risks of whatever that company produces in the world. These are all the incentive structures that we as a society have set up. And if we're unhappy with the results, then we need to change the incentive structures and not focus on Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk, however entertaining he is. These are folks that just operate within an ecosystem, and they're all playing by the rules that we wrote or didn't write. And so that's on us. That is something that we need to address.
Thank you so much. The next question is from the audience, from Aaron Leah. As you said earlier, technology moves at a considerably faster pace than democracy in terms of regulation. Do you think that the self-regulatory measures made by ChatGPT, example, not answering questions on certain topics, are sufficient, or should there be further protections in place?
That's a good question, Aaron. Thanks for asking. They've all been good questions. But to give you a sense of, what the difficulty, or in some sense, the lack of issue, or the lack of effect of self-regulation is it has really two problems. One is it prevents broader oversight, right? Someone like OpenAI can come along and say, oh, we're going to make some restrictions on what ChatGPT can do. But they're the ones who make the decisions about what the restrictions are, how expressive those restrictions happen to be, and who may actually still get access around those restrictions if they want to make that available. So those decisions don't get made by the people that this technology is going to impact. They get made by the people who are building the technology, who have a profit motive and other kinds of motivations to have the particular, choices that they make. One way I like to think about it is that, you can see some companies self-regulating. And the way I think about that self-regulation is, if you were to take the leadership of the company and replace it with a group of people who have diametrically opposed beliefs to your beliefs, what guardrails would you want to have in place to make sure that that technology was not doing something deleterious to society? Whatever those guardrails are, you should be willing to accept them no matter who's running the company, whether or not there are people who are diametrically opposed to you or whether or not they're your friends. And I say that having a lot of friends who are actually executives at these technology companies, when they ask me and they say, but we're well-intentioned, right? We're trying to do the right thing. I say, that's great, but I'm worried about who else might step into your role 6 months or a year or 10 years from now. And so we need to have guardrails that are democratically informed, that work for us in the broader perspective, rather than just being satisfied with a particular choice of self-regulation that an individual company makes at this time.
So you got to understand, so Meron, Rob, and I have now been working together for 6 years, and I get so excited when Meron speaks like this. I could have him teaching our class in democratic political theory, to our humanities students or social science students, one of the early employees at Google talking like a political theorist. And I think that's absolutely right. I think the other thing I'd just say in response to this question is that it's great that ChatGPT set in some constraints. In my view, it wasn't enough. And in fact, when you talk to the leadership of ChatGPT, they had originally intended to roll out ChatGPT as a way of learning about its potential use. But when they saw the potential that they had to scale, they just bought more and more compute power. And that's how they went from 1 million users to 5 million users to 100 million users overnight. That was a choice they made. It didn't need to be the choice that they made, but they saw an opportunity to dominate the market. And of course, that led to a flood of capital that they got. And what's kind of missing in the question that was asked is ChatGPT isn't the only player in this ecosystem. So ChatGPT comes out from OpenAI, and then all of a sudden you have a crisis at Google. You have a crisis at other companies. Like, where is our large language model? Where is our generative AI? And then you get a bunch of pressure to put it out quickly, to try and make it better, to impose less constraints on use, right? And so we saw all of the examples of that in the months after ChatGPT was released. The terrible stories about, what wasn't taken into account when these models were developed by some of the other providers. And the little microcosm of this that we live, and you probably live at Maryland, is the use of this technology with one particular externality, which is basically to facilitate cheating in high school and university campuses. The set of private companies that are already monetizing these technologies and targeting my 16-year-old son without regard to the consequences for the quality of his education, for the teachers and administrators that need to respond to this, that's just rank irresponsibility. Now, we can say it's not on the companies to figure that out, but I encourage folks in the audience to think, do we think our K-12 educators in the United States have the resources, the bandwidth, the expertise, the support that they need to reorient our education system overnight in response to a product that was released just for fun to see how people used it? They don't. And so these are the kinds of social consequences that we see repeated over and over again. And Silicon Valley's myth is that we can't know about these harms in advance. And so we just need to clean up later. And I hope if you read our book and you engage seriously with this material, you'll realize that that's just a self-serving, sort of myth that Silicon Valley has promoted in order to protect itself from bearing any responsibility for these harms.
So I want to go a little bit further with that question also, and think about how, so ChatGPT's obviously altered education in a number of fundamental ways, but in a kind of broader question, how do you see big tech altering the relationship between citizens and their governments? So what are the impacts of that?
Well, there's a lot of different facets there. Maybe I'll start and hand it over to Jeremy as well. There's both positives and negatives here. And one of them is certainly around the notion of what kind of responsibilities does the government have to protect its citizenry from things like misinformation? What kind of responsibility does it have to have a well-functioning democracy to make sure that people are informed? What sort of protections are in place for things like transparency and due process in decision-making environments where algorithms are now making those decisions? So these are questions that have to be taken seriously, because they are questions that, if left unanswered, mean that there is basically free rein in the marketplace to develop these technologies and have them be used however they're going to be used. And so if you think of the government as protecting particular rights of individuals, like privacy, for example, where do those lines get drawn? That's part of the question that we need to think about. At another level, one of the things you can also think about in terms of relationship of technology and government is in what ways can government harness technology for the benefit of its citizenry? And this is a place where, again, to Jeremy's point, we get the governmental systems that we are willing to accept. One of the things that we see with many of our students, for example, is, why wouldn't you go and work, for example, for the federal government, helping build the digital systems that help improve people's access to, for example, healthcare insurance, or help people get more information about how government spending works so they can make more informed decisions about how they want to vote and how they want resources allocated. And the truth is, they just don't get paid very well in government. So we essentially get that system that is what we are willing to accept. And if we think that there needs to be a more robust role for technology in government as a way of informing and benefiting the citizenry, that's something that we have to demand.
I'll just add two things to Mehran's response. The first is to say, new technologies create extraordinary opportunities for government to engage citizens and for citizens to engage governments in new ways. We have an absolute explosion of speech, an absolute explosion of access to information, ways of generating input. But of course, all of the optimism about how that would be democratizing has been replaced, with concerns about how that actually reinforces existing sort of power brokers and power holders. Maybe just a small micro example of that. In the United States, you have a process of regulatory comment. The idea being when the government is implementing a set of regulations that have impacts for potential stakeholders, stakeholders can provide input on those to inform the design of the regulation before it's ever been released. Those new technologies make it possible for people anywhere to provide that kind of input, to have visibility into the regulations. But who do you think uses that technology the most? Not the citizens who are potentially harmed by these new regulations, but the lobbyists who are paid by the businesses to basically flood those open comment processes with input that is in favor of whatever it is the business position. And so, yes, there are opportunities, but I think we've definitely moved beyond the naivete that technology is just liberalizing or democratizing in some fundamental sense. I think the bigger point to make is just the fact that we are, as many people have said, in a new Gilded Age, right? A new moment of gross inequality in the United States, a new moment of concentrated economic power that is being turned into political power. One needs to go no further than some distance from our coastal centers to understand what the geography of economic opportunity looks like in the United States in this day and age. And that is not divorced from the way in which economic power and political power is now being wielded by those who are benefiting from the skill-biased technological change that we have, those who benefit from Silicon Valley and its ability to monetize the data revolution, those who also benefit from a system of taxation and redistribution that really caters towards those at the upper end of the income redistribution. So how has big tech reshaped the relationship between government and citizens? Well, it's brought us into a second age of gross inequality and sort of the empowerment, both economically and politically, of a set of elites, which is why we see the rise of populism, both on the left and the right. And there's a common language between the leftist populace and the rightist populace. And it's about challenging existing holders of economic and political power and representing or reinforcing the idea that they're not looking out for the interests of people who are being left behind.
Thank you so much. We have one more question, and I'm looking at the time. I'm wondering if we could just quickly respond to this one. So the last question is from Geo Bays. Define what is ethics here. Don't do evil or do good or follow the best interest of the community or do as you will in a geo-libertarian sense.
Well, this is where we really needed Rob. This would have been his forte. But to try to channel him for a moment, I think there's debates about what is the right thing that is ethics, right? And different people will give you different answers. There's entirely different frameworks for how we might think about ethics, whether or not we believe in a sense of utilitarianism or maximizing the good for the most people, or some notion of duty or Kantian ethics or virtue-based ethics. There's lots of different frameworks, and reasonable people will come up with different answers. But part of the question is, even if when we get different people coming up with different answers, are there things in which there are some general agreements or the things we want? I think there are many things for which we believe that's the case now, for which we don't have guardrails in place to help actually ensure. And so you could think about, for example, a simple case would be with AI technology being able to accomplish more tasks, there's clearly going to be impact in the labor marketplace. What kinds of things should we do to help people whose jobs are going to be impacted by that technology be able to learn new skills and move into different kinds of trades in different sorts of sectors? That calls for more education. So you can already see that it's not, something that is unknowable. It's something where we can already see what these factors are, what the impacts will potentially be, what sort of steps we might want to take to get to a better outcome that is better for the individuals involved, that is better for those sectors, and is potentially better for all of society. The real question is, do we have the will to actually do that? And so that's the place where we want to try to motivate people to action, to say, these are the issues that are knowable, and we need to take a stance on those issues. There will certainly be things that we don't know, that we can't foresee, and we will deal with them when they become more apparent. But we should at least deal with the things we can see now in some reasonable way.
And I'll just add one other closing thought. In some sense, this is the oldest question that humans have debated since the beginning of deliberation, of philosophy, of figuring out how we live together. And it's the question of, what do we value? What does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to live in a good society? What does it mean to behave in responsible ways? How much do we value equal treatment versus equal outcomes, equal inputs? And one of the first messages that we have to our students, most of whom are technically trained first and foremost, is that there is no right answer to any of these questions. Even something as simple as do no evil, which was Google's, sort of bottom line, that's up to people to figure out what's evil and what's good. It's the essence of human deliberation and debate. And the central argument of our book is that each new step in the process of technological change involves value trade-offs. And we've largely gone through this process of technological change with the value trade-offs remaining implicit and hidden from view, and leaving it to technologists to referee those value trade-offs on our behalf. And that isn't working out very well. It's generating all sorts of consequences that people increasingly find unacceptable. And so there is no right answer to any of these questions. There's no rubric to grade from, like you are ethical here and you are not ethical here. Of course, there are some lines that we set in society, laws about stealing from people and committing violent acts against people. But that's the bare minimum, right? The real challenge of ethics is in the space of what's legal. And it's the question of, what do we value and how do we trade off competing values that are in tension with one another? How much privacy versus how much security? How much free speech versus protecting people from harassment, right? How much the benefits of generative AI in terms of economic well-being, and how much the sacrifice in terms of jobs for people at the lowest end of the income distribution? Those are our choices to make, and that's where ethics exists.
Thank you so much. What a rich conversation. Excellent. We really appreciate not only the wonderful comments that you made, but the answers to these very important questions. And I would like to have a slide put on the screen so people can see where to get your book. Again, the book is System Error, Where Big Tech Went Wrong and How We Can Reboot. And this is on the slide. You can see that you can now get it in paperback. And I highly recommend this book, written by Professors Reich, Sahami, and Weinstein. And I really would like to thank all of you, professors, for this wonderful, important topic that you covered so beautifully, and to remind the audience that fortunately we have recorded today's talk and presentation, and we will post it on our YouTube channel so that you can listen to it and share it with others. And again, thank you so much to the three of you, now two of you, for being with us today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'll just simply end by saying that this ends our academic year. This event today ends our events for this academic year, but we will post on our website our upcoming events for next year. And we ask that you go to our website every now and then and look at what we might post regarding our next academic year's programs. But to let you know that our annual lecture, which is scheduled for the 19th of October, 2023, we will have Amanda Ripley, who is a journalist. She is at Washington Post and has written many books, but in particular one called High Conflict. We really encourage you to consider coming to that lecture. It will be on campus on October 19. Anyway, we're looking forward to that lecture in particular. So please follow us, go to our website, and we'll look for you next autumn. Thank you.